The morning sun rested gently over the small New England town, painting everything in gold that couldn't quite warm the cold weight in Captain Raymond Doyle's chest. He sat at his kitchen table, a letter trembling slightly between his fingers, his medal resting just beside his coffee mug. The envelope bore the official seal of the county court, summoning him for property code violation he barely remembered committing. To anyone else, it was a minor inconvenience. To Ray, it was the quiet echo of a system that forgot its heroes the moment the war ended. He turned the medal over, its edges worn smooth from years of handling, a relic of both pride and loss. His daughter Emma entered, her expression caught between concern and tenderness, urging him to leave the medal at home. "It's not about pride," he said softly. "It's about remembrance." Outside, the wind rattled the flag on his porch, a weary salute to a man who'd never stopped standing at attention, even when the world stopped watching. The old pickup rumbled down Main Street, each turn of the wheel echoing in Ray's chest like memory. Emma sat beside him, scrolling through her phone, pretending not to notice how his knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. The courthouse tower appeared in the distance, red brick and self-importance against the sky. Ray's reflection in the windshield overlapped with the metal on his chest, sunlight glinting off it like a small, defiant flame. Townspeople glanced as he passed. Some nodded in respect, others simply stared. He wasn't a spectacle to himself, but he knew the look. People trying to measure the weight of a man's pride. The closer they came, the quieter the engine seemed, until all that was left was the sound of a flag somewhere snapping in the courthouse yard. Ray paused at the foot of the courthouse steps, boots touching stone polished by decades of judgment. He could smell the age of the building, dry paper and pride. Emma walked a step ahead, her shoulders tight. Ray's gaze swept the columns, the flag at half-mast, the carved words above the door. Equal justice under law. He smiled faintly at the irony. As he climbed, whispers floated from the crowd waiting outside, murmurs of recognition or doubt. A veteran's medal drew eyes the way a wound does, curiosity dressed as respect. He adjusted his jacket, straightened his back, and climbed the final step with a soldier's calm, each footfall echoing like a drum beat to a past he never escaped. Inside, the courthouse air felt colder. The echo of footsteps on tile carried through the hallway like hesitant applause. Ray sat among strangers. A mother clutching papers, a young man whispering into his phone, an old janitor sweeping near the wall. Emma signed them in at the counter, her voice professional but tight. Ray watched the seal of the court on the wall, a set of scales, balanced but lifeless, and thought of all the weight they never measured. Fear, memory, sacrifice. When Officer Torres, the bailiff, entered and met Ray's eyes, his polite nod carried more respect than any verdict could. Still, the hush that followed seemed to warn him. Justice in this place was not about truth. It was about control. A door creaked open, and a clerk's voice called, "Case of Doyle versus City of Franklin." Emma looked to her father. Ray rose slowly, every motion deliberate, as if answering roll call one last time. The courtroom doors waited ahead, tall and judgmental, light seeping through the cracks like interrogation lamps. Torres held the door open, his eyes flicking to the metal, then to Ray's face. For a heartbeat, something like reverence passed between them. Ray stepped through into the courtroom's silence, his boots echoing like memory on the polished floor. The gavel had not yet struck, but judgment already hung in the air. The courtroom smelled faintly of polish and paper, a place where even sunlight felt disciplined. Ray walked behind Emma, the sound of their steps swallowed by the carpet's hush. The benches were half-filled, townspeople, clerks, a few police officers waiting for routine hearings. Behind the bench sat Judge Harold Benton, his black robe hanging perfectly, his eyes already fixed on the man who carried a medal into his domain. Ray could feel that gaze like a command. Emma whispered something about keeping calm, but her father didn't answer. He had stood before higher authority before. This was just another kind of battlefield, quieter, but no less ruthless. When the bailiff called, "All rise," the room obeyed, and the old soldier stood straighter than any man there. Judge Benton's voice carried the tone of a man who mistook authority for wisdom. "Why, Captain Doyle," he began. Eyes not on the file before him, but on the metal gleaming faintly in the morning light. "We like to maintain a certain decorum in this courtroom. Decorations are not necessary here." Emma's head snapped up, her protest forming but dying in her throat when she felt her father's stillness beside her. Ray didn't move. The judge's words floated in the silence, heavier than they deserved. "Sir," Ray said at last, voice calm and even, "this isn't decoration." Benton's lip curled. "Remove it, or I'll hold you in contempt." The crowd shifted uneasily, the air electric with something that felt dangerously close to shame. "Remove it," Benton repeated, louder this time. The gavel struck wood with a hollow crack. Every sound in the room stilled. Even the faint hum of the ceiling fan seemed to pause. Ray's hand hovered near his chest, then stopped. The metal wasn't heavy. Yet it anchored decades of brothers and graves, and orders followed without question. He looked at the judge, his expression unreadable, neither defiant nor submissive, merely steady. "I can't do that, Your Honor," he said. Benton leaned forward, voice cold. "Then you can leave my courtroom." Emma's voice broke through, trembling but strong. "Your Honor, that medal represents service recognized by this government." Benton snapped. "And I represent this government here." The room breathed in, waiting to see what dignity looked like under command. The silence broke with the faint click of metal. Ray unpinned the medal, his fingers steady even as the tremor of memory coursed through him. The ribbon slipped free, the silver star landing on the defense table with a soft metallic tap that sounded louder than the judge's gavel. Emma looked away. Torres swallowed hard. Benton leaned back, satisfied, missing entirely the weight of what he had just stripped away. To him, it was compliance. To everyone else, it was desecration. Ray didn't speak. He merely rested his hands on the table, eyes fixed on the medal, as if saluting the ghosts that had once earned it. Somewhere deep inside, something quiet but fierce began to turn. Benton cleared his throat, pretending authority could hide discomfort. "Now that we've maintained order," he said, his tone brittle. But order had already shattered. Ray stood taller without the medal than he had with it. Emma reached toward him, but he shook his head faintly, signaling restraint. Torres shifted on his feet, eyes flicking toward the door as though expecting something or someone to intervene. The spectators' whispers grew, a low ripple beneath the still air. Benton tapped his pen impatiently, unaware that his courtroom had just become a story that would outlive his name. Ray looked at the judge and spoke quietly. "Order doesn't come from silence, Your Honor. It comes from respect." For the first time, Benton had no reply. The gavel struck once more, its echo hard and hollow, as if the sound itself wished to leave the room. Judge Benton began reading from the paperwork. Fines, citations, a list of bureaucratic slights masquerading as law. Ray stood motionless beside his daughter, the silver star lying dim on the table between them. Emma's eyes burned, every word from the bench landing like insult to injury. "Captain Doyle, while your service is appreciated," Benton said, "decorum applies equally to all citizens." The phrase hung in the air, smug and sterile. Ray simply nodded once. Inside, he felt something close to sorrow. Not for himself, but for what the country's symbols had come to mean in the mouths of men like this. He had faced bullets quieter than this man's contempt. Whispers spread like a current through the benches. A man in a worn veteran's cap leaned to another, muttering, "That ain't right." A woman crossed her arms, shaking her head. Benton's pen scratched paper, ignoring the unease gathering in his courtroom. Emma turned slightly, catching the eyes of those behind her, solidarity glowing faintly in the silence. Ray noticed it too. The murmurs carried weight, the first quiet rebellion against the robe's authority. Benton looked up sharply, irritated by the whispering. "This is my courtroom," he snapped, but his words no longer filled the air the same way. Something had changed. Dignity, once forced to kneel, was beginning to rise. Benton's composure cracked. "If there are any more interruptions," he warned, voice sharp, "I will clear this room." He looked down at Ray again, his irritation now personal. "You may think your service entitles you to special treatment, Captain, but in here, everyone was equal." Emma rose then, her voice calm but cutting. "With respect, Your Honor, equality doesn't mean erasing sacrifice." A silence heavier than anger filled the air. Benton froze, unsure whether to chastise her or retreat. Ray gently touched her wrist, a silent command for restraint. She lowered her eyes. But the damage was done. The courtroom had seen courage stand taller than rank. The judge's threats echoed, but no one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't submission. It was judgment of a different kind. Ray looked down at the silver star lying on the table, and for a moment, his reflection shimmered faintly in its surface. He remembered faces that would never stand in court, men who'd earned medals they'd never wear. When he looked up again, his gaze found Benton's, calm and unbroken. Benton shifted slightly, suddenly smaller in his own chair. The silence pressed inward until even the air felt heavy with shame. Ray didn't need words. The truth was already speaking through the room's stillness. When the session recessed, Benton left the bench without a glance, his robe sweeping behind him like retreat. The clerk announced a break, but no one moved. Ray reached down, picked up his medal, and held it in his hand a moment before slipping it into his pocket. Emma looked at him, her voice low. "You didn't have to do that." He smiled faintly. "I didn't." As they turned to leave, Torres opened the door, his gaze steady, respectful, almost protective. The crowd parted in silence, not for authority, but for the man who had carried it with humility. Outside the courtroom, sunlight flooded through the windows, soft and forgiving. The battle wasn't over, but dignity had already reclaimed its ground. The corridor outside the courtroom was long, pale, and echoing, the kind of space that made even footsteps sound like guilt. Ray walked beside Emma in silence, the air thick with unspoken frustration. Down the hall, Officer Torres lingered near the door, his eyes following them, worry etched across his young face. Ray stopped beside a bench, pulling the silver star from his pocket, turning it over in his hand as if to remind himself it was still real. At that same moment, the courthouse entrance opened. The sound of polished shoes on marble broke the stillness. A woman in uniform strode through, her bearing unmistakable. General Margaret Hale, a legend to every Marine who'd ever served under her command, moved with quiet purpose. The guards at the door instinctively straightened, and even the air seemed to shift. Justice had just entered the building. Ray looked up as the footsteps neared, and for the first time that morning, his posture changed. Not from defensiveness, but recognition. "General Hale," he murmured, disbelief soft in his voice. Margaret's eyes flicked toward him, confusion for a split second before memory surfaced. "Captain Doyle," she said, the title carrying weight no courtroom could command. The corridor froze around them. Emma's eyes widened, realizing instantly who this woman was. Hale studied Ray, her gaze falling to the faint imprint where his medal had been pinned. "What happened here?" she asked quietly. The question wasn't to Ray, nor to Emma. It was directed toward the very air, as if demanding an answer from the building itself. When Hale learned what had happened, that a judge had ordered a decorated Marine to remove his medal in court, her jaw tightened, and something cold and resolute entered her expression. "Which courtroom?" she asked. Torres, hesitant but reverent, pointed down the hall. Hale's stride was steady and measured, her polished shoes clicking like a countdown. Ray tried to stop her, but she only glanced back, her tone calm yet final. "You've taken enough orders, Captain. Let me give one for a change." Emma stared, realization dawning that justice for once was walking toward them in full uniform. The corridor filled with motion, whispers, and the faint rustle of command returning to its rightful place. The courtroom door loomed again, but this time the sound approaching it carried a different gravity. Inside, Benton had resumed session, unaware of the storm gathering outside his jurisdiction. The murmurs of the crowd paused when the latch clicked. Officer Torres opened the door wide, his voice steady. "General Margaret Hale, United States Marine Corps." Every head turned. Benton blinked, startled, as Hale entered with the calm of someone who didn't need to raise her voice to command a room. Her uniform caught the light, sharp lines of silver and brass. Ray remained by the doorway, watching the unspoken power shift. Benton rose, trying to mask confusion with authority. "General, this is a closed municipal proceeding," he began. "Not anymore," she said. General Hale faced the judge, her expression calm but searing. "Your Honor," she said evenly, "I just learned that one of my Marines was ordered to remove a combat medal in this courtroom." Benton stammered. "This is a civilian proceeding." "And yet you disrespected the symbol of service that allows this court to exist," she interrupted, her voice steady as command fire. The silence that followed was unbearable. Ray stood still, watching, every ounce of humiliation transmuted into vindication. Emma exhaled slowly, tears she didn't permit to fall. Benton swallowed hard, his authority stripped by the quiet precision of truth. Hale turned, looked at Ray, and said simply, "At ease, Captain." In that moment, the courtroom became hallowed ground. General Hale stood perfectly still before the bench, her eyes fixed on Judge Benton like a sculptor assessing flawed stone. "Do you understand what that medal means, Your Honor?" she asked, her voice calm but edged with authority. Benton tried to steady his hands on the desk. "This is a civilian matter, General. My courtroom." She cut him off with a glance that could have frozen the air. "That man earned that star in Kandahar, 2003, when others didn't come home. You ordered him to remove it. You didn't just strip metal from a jacket. You stripped honor from the air of this room." The silence that followed was electric, a truth laid bare before everyone present. Benton's lips parted, but no defense came. For the first time, he looked small beneath his own robe. "Captain Doyle?" Hale said, turning toward him. "I was there that day. You carried Sergeant Allen out under fire, didn't you?" Ray nodded slowly, humility soft in his voice. "Yes, man. Allen didn't make it." A shadow passed over her features, the memory deep and unspoken. "He made it far enough to save 3 others. Including me," she said quietly. The room gasped, history binding itself into the present. Benton blinked, realizing far too late the weight of his own ignorance. Hale turned back to him. "You see, Your Honor, that medal you ordered removed. It once reflected the light of men who never saw home again. It deserves your respect, not your rules." The power in her words transcended rank. It was justice made flesh. Benton tried to recover, fumbling for words. "General, I meant no, you meant exactly what you said," she interrupted. "And now you'll stand corrected." Her voice was sharp, but not cruel. It carried the calm certainty of moral command. She turned to Torres. "Officer, return the captain's medal to him." Torres moved immediately, stepping forward with measured respect. He picked up the silver star from the table as if handling something sacred and placed it in Ray's open hand. The medal gleamed once more, no longer dim. Benton sank slowly into his chair. The crowd watched in absolute silence as Ray repinned the medal, the faint click of the clasp echoing louder than any gavel. Then came the moment that would etch itself into every soul present. Hale stepped forward, stopping before Ray. The courtroom stood still, not breathing. Slowly, deliberately, she raised her right hand to her brow and saluted. a full, formal military salute to a man once under her command. "Captain Raymond Doyle," she said softly, "your service and your silence honor us all." The sound that followed wasn't applause but quiet weeping. Taurus straightened instinctively. Emma stood beside her father, and even Benton lowered his eyes. For 6 seconds, the world remembered what respect looked like. The salute hung in the air, a living verdict rendered not by law, but by truth. When Hale's hand lowered, no one spoke. The gavel sat forgotten on the bench. Benton looked around at the standing crowd. His authority evaporated. Hale turned toward him, her voice calm but final. "You may run this courtroom, Your Honor, but men like Captain Doyle built the ground it stands on." Then she turned and nodded to Ray. He saluted once more, not to her, but to the ideals she had just restored. As they exited together, the spectators stood motionless, not daring to sit until the last trace of their footsteps faded. In that silence, justice was no longer an institution. It was a living thing, breathing again through dignity reclaimed. The doors swung open, and sunlight met them like absolution. Ray stepped into it slowly, the warmth brushing over his face as if the world itself had been waiting for him. Behind him, the murmurs began. Not of gossip, but reverence. Reporters raised cameras. Townspeople whispered his name, and somewhere, a child saluted clumsily. General Hale followed, her stride calm, eyes fixed ahead. Emma reached for her father's arm, steadying him more from emotion than weakness. The flag over the courthouse fluttered in a breeze that smelled of autumn and change. In that moment, Ray felt the years fall from his shoulders. He hadn't fought for applause, only to walk freely with dignity. Now he did. Word spread faster than reason. The image of the salute had already reached phones, cameras, and hearts by the time the courthouse clock struck noon. Veterans from across the county began arriving, some in uniform, others carrying worn caps and old photos. The square outside the courthouse transformed, not into a protest, but a vigil of gratitude. Ray stood quietly among them, uncomfortable with the attention but deeply moved by it. A young soldier approached, barely 20, saluting him with nervous reverence. Ray returned the gesture with a faint, humble smile. In the background, Hale watched, her face unreadable, but her eyes shimmering with pride. Justice for once had gone viral, and it looked like humility. Inside, Judge Benton sat alone in his chambers, the robe folded over his chair like a surrendered banner. The echo of the salute still played in his mind, louder than any verdict he had rendered. He glanced at his reflection in the window, the image of a man who had mistaken position for respect. The crowd's murmurs carried faintly through the glass, like waves of conscience breaking against the walls. He opened the court record file, marked Doyle with City of Franklin, and stared at the page for a long time before writing 3 words in the margin. Case dismissed. With respect. Then, quietly, he removed his robe, folded it neatly, and left it on his desk. For the first time, Harold Benton looked human. Later that afternoon, a local reporter approached Ray and General Hale near the courthouse steps. The microphone trembled slightly as she asked, "Captain Doyle, how does it feel to have justice finally served?" Ray smiled faintly, glancing toward Hale before answering. "Justice isn't something you get," he said. "It's something you carry, even when no one's watching." Hale nodded, her eyes on the horizon. Emma looked at her father with pride, realizing his words would outlive the moment. The reporter lowered the microphone, visibly moved. Behind them, the flag swayed in slow rhythm, as if keeping time with the heartbeat of a nation quietly remembering what decency sounds like. As twilight fell, the courthouse steps emptied, but the air still carried the echo of what had happened there. Ray stood alone beneath the dimming sky, the flag above whispering in the night breeze. Emma waited beside the truck, giving him space. Hale had already departed quietly, the last light catching on her departing car. Ray looked down at the medal once more, fingers brushing over the worn metal. He didn't see victory in it. He saw memory, weight, and the cost of peace. When he finally turned to go, the courthouse behind him no longer looked like a place of judgment, but of redemption. The stars were just beginning to appear, quiet, countless, and watching. By the next morning, the courthouse had become a pilgrimage site. Flowers and flags lined the steps. Veterans, students, and strangers came not for spectacle, but to stand in the place where dignity had been restored. The local paper carried the headline, "General Salutes Veteran in Courtroom Drama," yet Ray avoided the attention. He walked quietly down Main Street with Emma, nodding politely to those who stopped him, his humility making the gesture all the more profound. The town that had once judged him now looked at him differently. Not as a defendant, but as a reminder that respect was not a law to be enforced, but a value to be lived. That afternoon, Judge Benton arrived unannounced at Ray's modest home. He removed his hat before knocking, humility awkward in his posture. Ray opened the door, expression unreadable. Benton spoke quietly. "Captain Doyle, I owe you more than an apology." Ray stepped aside, gesturing him in. They stood by the small kitchen table, the same place where the summons had once lain. "I forgot what this robe means," Benton said. "It's supposed to serve people like you, not silence them." Ray nodded, his voice gentle. "We all forget sometimes, Judge. What matters is remembering before it's too late." When Benton left, he did so without his arrogance. Only gratitude and the weight of decency rediscovered. Days later, Ray received a letter sealed with the Marine Corps emblem. It was from General Hale. Her handwriting was steady and unadorned. "Some honors are given, others are earned again when no one's looking. You reminded us all why we salute." Beneath it was a small invitation to speak at a Memorial Day ceremony. Ray folded the letter carefully, his eyes moist but steady. Emma found him by the window, reading it once more. "You'll go?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Not for me. For them." Outside, the flag stirred on his porch, catching the afternoon wind. The same wind that had once carried the order to remove his medal, now carrying it higher than ever. On Memorial Day, the town gathered at the park beneath a field of waving flags. The sun blazed high and rows of chairs faced a simple wooden podium. General Hale stood in full uniform at the front row, her eyes on Ray as he stepped up to speak. His voice was calm, carrying across the crowd with gentle strength. "This medal," he said, touching the silver star, "doesn't belong to one man. It belongs to everyone who ever stood for what's right when it wasn't easy." The crowd stood in silence, hats pressed to hearts. For the first time, Ray felt peace not in being saluted, but in saluting back. To life, to loss, to honor reborn. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Ray stood once more on his porch. The medal rested over his heart, the flag above him fluttering softly in the dying light. Emma joined him quietly, resting her head against his shoulder. "You think people will remember?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "Maybe not my name, but they'll remember what's right." Across town, in a small park, a boy of 10 raised his hand in a clumsy salute toward the setting sun. The wind carried that gesture across the quiet streets, a salute to a man who never asked for reverence, only respect. The screen fades to gold as Ray looks toward the horizon, the light of justice lingering in his eyes.